Hello, everybody. Welcome to Through Time and Clades. My name is Albert.
And I'm Joan.
Great. So today we are doing Dinosaurs, the second chapter again, so my series on bird evolution. And we're going to go through several groups of birds that I suspect most people aren't familiar with, unless you happen to live within their range. So I think it'll be quite an interesting one. How about you?
Oh, I think so too. These is definitely territory that I'm not well versed in. I am familiar with these birds, but that's
Hmm.
because I'm a nerd when it comes to natural history and things.
Right.
But there are like the nitty gritty details that I could use a refresher course or two.
Oh, sure. Yeah, definitely. um, and besides that, how has your week been?
I mean, besides work on this series, I started a brand new book um, by Tom Higham, and this book just came out. I'm technically supposed to wait until October until it becomes available in the United States.
Hmm.
I didn't want to wait that long, so I just put in the extra money and got it shipped from there to here. So I currently started reading that, and I'm loving what I'm reading so far. It's very good. So far, I've been very impressed with it.
Fantastic.
And what about on your end? How are things?
Oh, so I haven't been. Fortunately, I've had a bit of a more normal week this week compared to the past two, where I was very very busy with a lot of different things. Yeah, this week has been a bit more normal. Of course, I'm still have a lot on my plate with research and trying to get my thesis finished, and that's going to be the case for a little while. But other than that, yeah, not too much unusual to report, I guess. Um, things have been all right for me.
Well, good. I'm glad to hear that.
Alrighty. So, do you think we should get started then?
Sure, let's do it.
Alrighty. So let's go on to the next slide for a little bit of a refresher as to where we were before this episode. So we just started in the last episode looking at this big group of birds called Telleraves, the Telleravians, also called the core land birds, and they include a massive radiation, mostly tree dwelling birds, although there are some ground dwelling ones too. Um, and they come in all kinds of shapes and sizes and habits, and so it's going to take us several episodes to kind of work our way through all this great diversity. Um, Now, last time we looked at a few of the groups that are raptorial, so they are primarily vertebrate eaters. Um, so we looked at New World vultures and the accipitriforms, which include things like eagles and hawks, and we looked at the nocturnal owls. But as you can see on here, there are a number of other groups that we still have yet to cover, and this episode we will start looking at one particular group called the coraciimorphs, although we won't finish them. We will finish them next episode. But we'll start looking at a few groups in this one, and I think these are quite a varied bunch with a lot of interesting and unusual features and adaptations. So they are definitely a group I'm quite interested in. Now, not all members of the coraciimorphs have traditionally been thought to be closely related, although most of them have generally been thought to have had something to do with each other. Um, but it really has been with the genetic studies of recent times that we've really started sorting out their kind of detailed relationships. And so there haven't been a lot of kind of anatomical features that have been identified that characterize this group as a whole. Um, but even so, we will take a good look at each of the individual major groups and see what they're like, because they are quite a diverse group. Okay, so in this episode, we will look at three particular groups of coraciimorphs, and so if we go to the next slide, we will get started with one of them. All right, so uh, first up, we have the mousebirds, and probably many people are not familiar with this group. It's if you haven't heard of mousebirds before, you're probably not alone. There are only 6 living species, and they are all found in sub-Saharan Africa, especially in semi-open habitats. So they do live in the trees, but they don't usually live in dense forests. They mostly live in places like scrubland or savanna, where there are some trees dotting the landscape, and they can kind of fly back and forth between them, but not as much in very dense kind of habitats. However, as we shall see very shortly, there are fossils of mousebirds from other parts of the world that where they are not found today. Now, the mousebirds are very well adapted to living in the trees. Um, they spend most of their time in the trees, and they can kind of run around among the branches and across the branches and through the branches in a variety of ways. They kind of scurry along branches, and that's probably the reason they are called mouse birds, because when they're kind of running along branches, they kind of look like little rodents or something with their very long tail feathers and kind of round, fluffy bodies. So yeah, I guess mouse bird is a pretty good name for them. You can probably also think of them as squirrel birds since they're living up in the trees. But yeah, they are definitely a really interesting group in that regard, and kind of helping them in this kind of arboreal habit are their feet, and because with their feet they can do things that pretty much no other birds can do. So we've talked a lot about kind of toe arrangements in birds, how some birds have certain toes pointing backwards and some pointing forwards and all that. And the standard bird foot, what we see in modern day, is a foot with 3 toes pointing forward and 1 pointing backwards. So that's called an anisodactyl foot. And mouse birds can have an anisodactyl foot. They can point 1 toe backwards, the innermost toe or hallux, and use that to kind of perch on a branch, like a lot of quote unquote normal birds might do. But they can also swivel their outermost toe backwards as well, and so that would give them a zygodactyl foot, where you have 2 toes pointing backwards and 2 forwards, which is seen in some other tree-dwelling birds. But in a lot of those other groups, the zygodactyl condition is permanent. They can't just switch between them whenever they want to, but a mouse bird can. And not only that, but mouse birds can also swivel their innermost toe, that hallux, forward, so that all of their toes are pointing forward, which is pretty useful for clinging to kind of vertical kind of surfaces. So yeah, you can see how all these different toe arrangements help them kind of navigate their arboreal environments, which is really neat. Now, even though they are very specialized for this kind of arboreal habit, it's quite interesting that mouse birds are actually quite good at kind of running around on the ground as well if they have to. Sometimes if they happen to see something they want to eat on the ground, or if they want a drink of water, they can come down to the ground and walk around for a bit. It's not really much of a problem for them. So yeah, they are definitely quite an interesting group in that regard. As to what they actually eat, they primarily eat plant material, so especially fruit. They can also live on leaves as well. They have microorganisms in their gut that help them digest leaves. And they'll eat some insects and things like that, but primarily they are herbivorous birds. So that is pretty neat. And the kind of position of mouse birds in bird phylogeny has been a sort of open question for a long time, and to an extent it still is. Traditionally, there have been all kinds of hypotheses about what they're most closely related to. A very popular one was that they're closely related to parrots, which are also kind of arboreal, mostly herbivorous birds. But with the new genetic studies, we now know that mouse birds and parrots probably are not particularly close relatives, although they both belong to Teleraves. And most of the recent genetic studies put mouse birds in this group, the coraciimorphs, although there are still some lines of genetic evidence that place them elsewhere in Teleraves. But I think given the weight of the recent evidence, I am provisionally putting them here with the rest of the coraciimorphs. But nonetheless, they clearly have a lot of interesting specializations that aren't really seen in other birds. And furthermore, when food is scarce, they can also undergo what we call torpor, so a kind of dormant state where they lower their metabolism a lot, so they don't have to spend a lot of energy and lower their body temperature um, at night when they're sleeping, and that allows them to conserve energy so that they don't have to spend as much of it when food is scarce. So that's an interesting adaptation as well. We actually previously saw this ability in some of the members of Strysaures, so the group that includes nightjars and potus and hummingbirds and so forth. So a lot of those guys are able to undergo torpor, and so can mousebirds, even though they are not close relatives. So mousebirds really kind of combine features from a lot of other different bird groups, but also have a number of specializations of their own, and that makes them quite a distinctive and interesting group. Also, I might as well add this. They are one of the few bird groups that can drink without using gravity. Basically, if you look at how most birds drink, they'll kind of scoop up water and kind of tip their heads back so that the water kind of flows down their throat. But mouse birds are actually capable of suction drinking, so they can just dip their beak in the water and just suck the water up, which is not something that most birds can do. We did previously see this before in the pigeons, which are also capable of this, and there are also some finch-like songbirds from Australia that can do this. But otherwise, yeah, it's not a common ability among birds. So again, mouse birds have all these weird features that are shared by only some groups of birds, or even in some cases no other groups of birds. So they're definitely a group that I'm quite fascinated by. How about you?
Yeah, they're certainly curious. They must have like a really derived skeletal anatomy in the foot to be able to do that,
Yeah.
or are they just like really really flexible?
Yeah, they do have fairly distinctive foot anatomy that does allow that, yes.
That's awesome.
Yeah. So naturally, I haven't been to Africa, so of course I haven't had the fortune of seeing these guys in the wild. But I have seen them a couple times in zoos, but not often. They're definitely not common even in captivity, and I think that's going to be true of all the groups we're going to talk about today. There aren't many chances to get to know them, unfortunately.
Right. Yeah, nothing's coming to me whether I've seen any of these in any zoo that I've visited.
Right.
Um, I'd have to like really, really like go back to all my photos and stuff to see for sure. But yeah, no, nothing's coming to me.
Yeah, yeah. But if you lived in the Paleogene, which if you did, probably wouldn't be a human at the time because there were no humans then. But if you lived in the Paleogene, and even if you lived in Europe or North America, where there are no mouse birds to be found today, you probably would be familiar with mouse birds because they were in fact a super diverse group during the Paleogene, and we found fossils of them in North America and in Europe, of many different species, and sometimes in great numbers. So on the next few slides, we're going to meet some of these fossil stem mousebirds. So of course they are not modern mousebirds, but they are more closely related to mousebirds than to anything else. And as we shall see, they exhibit quite a diversity of kind of morphologies and ecologies probably as well. So even though mouse birds today are so weird, they kind of did more than just what they do today, but spanned a very wide range of ecological niches. So on the next slide, we can start with this one from the Oligocene of Germany. So this is one of the European stem mouse birds. This is Oligocoleus, which is an appropriate name, so Oligocene mouse bird, basically. Straightforward enough. And this is one of the species of Oligocoleus. There are two species that have been named. This one is Oligocoleus psittacocephalon. And so psittacocephalon means parrot-headed. And the reason it's named that is because basically at the base of its bill, it's pretty hard to tell from the photos, I guess, because the fossil was crushed. But at the base of the bill of Oligocoleus, there's a very well-developed joint, kind of that joining the upper beak to the rest of the skull. And of course, we've spoken before about how modern birds often have this kind of mobile joint in this region, the skull. but it is definitely more well developed in, or better developed in some birds than in others. And in parrots, it is extremely well developed. Parrots can flex the upper beak up and down to a very extreme degree, and it really helps them kind of manipulate their food items in their jaws. And it seems that this stem mouse bird, Oligocoleus, had a very similar adaptation, so it could probably was able to handle things like large fruits and things. And in fact, we have direct evidence that it was eating large fruits, because if you look at the throat region of this fossil right here, you can see these kind of rounded structures. These rounded, and they've been flattened because the fossil has been flattened, but these rounded disc-like structures as preserved. And these are seeds. These are huge seeds from some kind of fruit, probably, that this mouse bird has swallowed. And so it seems that, like modern mouse birds, Oligocoleus mostly fed on fruits, but it might have been particularly adapted for eating very large fruits that it could kind of gulp down with its very mobile jaws. And something else that was probably helping it gulp down these fruits was that if you look to the, well, it's easier to see on the right photo, I think. If you look at the region of its lower jaw, you can see a long projection coming out the back of its lower jaw. We call that the retroarticular process. We've actually seen that before in the series. Members of Galloancerae, the chicken and duck group, tend to have a very long retroarticular process, and so does this stem mouse bird. So that's where a lot of the jaw opening muscles tend to attach. And so birds that need to open the jaws wide often have a very well developed kind of retroarticular process, and so maybe this was something else that was helping Oligocoleus kind of open its mouth very wide, like gaping, and helping it swallow down these huge fruits that it was probably eating. So that is pretty neat. And actually, we will see that a number of stem mouse birds have this kind of elongated retroarticular process. So it seems to have been a pretty common feature among them. Do you have anything to comment on?
No, not particularly.
All right, so let's go on to the next few fossils. So both of these pictured on here are members of, well, they are members of mousebirds, but they were found in the Messel Formation in Germany, which we've spoken about many times. A great site for fossil birds. Lots and lots of very well-preserved fossil bird specimens have been found in Messel, and including at least these two stem mousebirds, and actually a few other species too. We'll meet them later. So first of all, we have a Massilocoleus on the left, and Massilocoleus also has these very long retroarticular processes, although they're maybe not so obvious in this particular picture here. But probably the most unusual thing about Massilocoleus is that its feet. Its feet. It seems to have had permanently pamprodactyl feet. So pamprodactyl is the condition where all four toes are pointing forward, which is a very rare condition in modern birds. In fact, I think essentially non-existent. I mean, it is often said that swifts have pamprodactyl feet, but although they are capable of adopting such a posture, their feet are really more anisodactyl in their default pose, and same with the similar in that regard to mouse birds, although they can't do zygodactyl. But Massilocoleus is known from several specimens, and although can be pretty difficult to interpret these kinds of flattened fossils, it does seem that potentially this pamprodactyl foot was a genuine feature that this particular species had. So yeah, what was it doing? Maybe clinging to kind of vertical surfaces a lot, so maybe clinging to tree trunks instead of perching. Hard to say, but certainly a very unusual feature for a bird. And on the right there is Cascacoleus, or Cascacocoleus. I always forget the little bit in the middle. Cascacocoleus, which actually was originally named from a species found in North America, but this is a second species that was later discovered in the Messel, and it has very well developed retroarticular processes. You can see it, it's actually labeled on the image here. The arrows show you where the retroarticular processes start and end. So one arrow is pointing basically to the jaw joint region, and the other is pointing to the tip of the retroarticular process. And it's got this really long retroarticular process. And the shape of its beak is very different from modern mousebirds. It's very long and sharp, whereas modern mousebirds have a very rather kind of short beak. In fact, the author who described this specimen, Gerald Meyer, he commented in the paper that if all he knew about Cascococoleus was this one skull, he probably wouldn't have said it was a stem mousebird at all. He probably wouldn't have been able to identify it as one. However, because he knows of a more complete specimen of the species held in a private collection, uh, which does exhibit mousebird features in the rest of its skeleton. That's why he was able to identify it as a stem mousebird. Yeah, if it was just the skull, that would have been very difficult. So that kind of tells you something about how weird it is. In fact, this skull, in terms of its shape, actually kind of resembles the skull of some kinds of what we call New World blackbirds or icterids. Now, if you live in North America, you can think things like grackles and cowbirds. Although cowbirds don't quite have that kind of skull. And in South America, we have things like oropendulas, and also the American Orioles are also members of the New World blackbird. So things like the Baltimore Oriole are also icterids, and many of them have this kind of rather conical, triangular beak and very long retroarticular processes. And one of the ways that they feed is that they will kind of pierce through fruits with their sharp beaks, and then open their jaws while it's embedded inside the fruit, and so kind of make the opening wider, and then that allows them to get at the flesh inside. Others will use the beak to kind of pry under pieces of bark, for example. Some will kind of do this with the ground. Meadowlarks are a type of a New World blackbird as well, even though they're not black colored, I guess. And they'll often stick their beaks into the ground and kind of open their jaws wide to kind of widen the hole that they've made, and then kind of get at insects or other invertebrates in the ground that way. So kind of this kind of gaping feeding strategy is a common feature of the New World blackbirds, and it also seems to have been the case in Cascococoleus. So that is quite an unusual species. Do you have anything to add to this?
Yeah, I mean, I was just about to make the grackle comparison myself.
Oh yeah.
I'm looking at the skull. It's so strange. But I mean, like, yeah, I mean, I guess for a group of birds that's been around since the Paleogene,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's certainly plenty of time for there to be such a wide morphological diversity among forms than just the sick. I mean, I'm just thinking about like hyraxes,
Oh
for
yeah,
example.
right.
They are closely related to the elephants. They're Afrotherians.
Mm-hmm.
And there's like 4 or 5 species around today, and they're all these little fuzzballs that have tusks, and they climb trees or hang out on rocks. But like they reach the size of like pigs and cows, I think, and
Yeah.
they probably would have looked very different from what we see today. So
Right.
because they've been around for so long as well. So yeah, it totally makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. That's definitely an interesting parallel with the hyraxes and the increased diversity in the fossil record for sure. And they are both African groups today too, so that's kind of fun. Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, definitely. In fact, Cassisi rostris, the species name here on this species of Cascococoleus, means the beak of a cacique, which is another group of New World blackbirds. So it was named after this feature, which is quite appropriate. Now let's go to the next one. Yeah, so this is one from North America, from the Green River Formation, another formation we've talked about a lot. Also an excellent site for bird fossils. So basically, a huge amount of what we know about Eocene birds comes from these two formations, the Green River in the western United States and the Messel in Germany. So this one from the Green River is called Solaricoleus. And it preserves feathers, as you can see. You can see the arrows pointing to the feathers on this specimen here. They're not super well preserved, but they're definitely there. And what's really unusual about Solaricoleus is that, especially if you look to the lower right corner of the image, its wing feathers are extremely long, and they form a sort of kind of very narrow, sickle-shaped wing almost. Interesting, isn't it? So in
Yeah.
modern, yeah, in modern mousebirds, the wing is usually quite short and rounded, and they don't usually fly for very long distances. They'll fly from tree to tree, and that's about it. But clearly Celericolius was flying in a very different way because it's got these really long sickle-shaped wings, and if you've been following the series all this way, that might sound familiar because that sounds a lot like the wings of a swift. So yeah, it's got these very long swift-like wings, and swifts, of course, are amazing flyers. They're very fast flyers that kind of spend most of their lives in the air and catch insects on the wing. Um, Now, we don't know exactly what Celericolius was doing ecologically. It does have a skull preserved, but it's not very well preserved, unfortunately, so we don't really know what the shape of its beak was like or anything. But presumably it was doing something where kind of flying around, potentially in at very high speeds, or was important, and probably somewhere out in relatively open environments. And indeed, the name Celericolius means swift mousebird. So yeah, they named it after that feature as well. So that's definitely another kind of unexpected morphology we wouldn't have, you know, predicted from the fossil record, or in the fossil record. And in addition to the wing feathers, it also has preserved these really long tail feathers as well, which you can see in the upper left corner. And modern mousebirds do have long tail feathers as well, so that's less unexpected. But certainly the odd wing shape, yeah, that would be great to have an even better preserved specimen of this. Just try and figure out exactly what it was doing.
Yeah, it took me a second to kind of figure out what I was looking at here. So the arrow's on the very top. That's the tail.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, so it's like it's kind of like its wings are forward.
Yeah, right, right.
Gotcha. Yeah, that is really interesting. I can kind of picture it now. Um, wow, a swift mouse bird. That's awesome.
Yeah, right. That's a combination you wouldn't have expected. Yeah, definitely. That's a really cool one. One of my favorite stem mouse birds, and there are a lot to choose from. Now, the next one on the next slide is it's not so weird. This one is Selmes. This is also from the Meso, so this is the third one we've seen from the Meso. And in fact, its genus name Selmes is basically the word Meso with the letters scrambled. So yeah, um,
Oh,
that's where it comes from. So Selmes is not quite as weird as the ones we've just seen, although it does still have some differences from modern mouse birds. For example, the shape of its beak is quite different. It's kind of got this moderately long pointed bill, which is quite unlike the very short bill of modern mouse birds. In Selmes, it looks more like a more generalist bill. Maybe it was eating some insects, some fruit, a little bit of everything. Um, but we do know that it was probably somewhat more closely related to modern mouse birds than the next group we'll see, which are one of the more stem-word mouse birds, because it has a feature at the end of its tail. So its pygostyle is widened, and this is a feature that is not commonly seen among birds, although we do see it in mouse birds. Um, in modern mouse birds at least. And the reason they have this is because I guess when mouse birds have a very interesting kind of habitual posture when they're hanging out in the trees. Of course, they can perch on top of a branch like in regular birds, and like in the image I showed at the beginning when I was introducing mouse birds. But something else they like to do is that they kind of like to dangle on under a branch, sort of, with their feet kind of held up at the chest level and their bodies kind of hanging down from the branch. And while they're doing this, they like to use their very long tail feathers to prop against maybe another branch or somewhere further down the branch or on, or against a tree trunk or something. And because they use the tail as this kind of prop, they have this widened pygostyle at the end of their tail. And the pygostyle is the region of the tail where the vertebrae are fused, which is the case in modern birds. In modern birds, the tail is very short, and the last few vertebrae are fused together, forming this structure that we call the pygostyle. And in mouse birds, they have a very distinctive looking pygostyle, and Selmes is kind of one of the most stem word, as we say, so kind of the most distant relative of modern mousebirds to possess this feature. So seems that it was kind of around this region of the tree where this kind of behavior started. And also, like modern mousebirds, it has relatively kind of slender feet that might have been used in similar manner to kind of dangle from branches and things. So that's kind of fun. Um, Now, in contrast to that, on the next slide is a group called the sand coleids, and we know of several species of sand coleids from both Europe and North America. So in the meso, we have Eoglossydium, which are represented by the images on this slide. So yeah, we have four stem mouse birds in the meso alone so far that we've met. So we have let's see, Cascaca coleus and Macilla coleus and Salmes and Eoglossydium. And Eoglossydium might, be represented by several different species. So potentially we have at least 5 or more stem mouse birds in the meso that have been discovered alone. That's almost equivalent to the mouse bird diversity of today, where we have 6 species. So clearly, mouse birds were very diverse in the Paleogene. So the sand coleids are known from the Paleocene and the Eocene. In fact, one of the oldest Cenozoic bird fossils that we can actually confidently identify as belonging to any specific modern group is a sand coleid, and that is Zidiatzi from Paleocene of New Mexico, about 62.5 million years old. And so, yeah, that's clearly shows that birds had already diversified quite significantly, even that early in the Paleocene. And of course, that brings us to the usual question about when exactly this diversification happened. And if you want to know about that, you can check out some of the previous episodes, especially the first episode, where I go into quite a lot of detail about the controversies and my own thoughts about when modern birds, diversified. Even so, it's quite a claim to fame that stem mouse birds are some of the earliest known birds we can identify from Cenozoic rocks. Now, kind of different from Salmes and different from crown mouse birds is that sand coleids had relatively shorter and stouter hind limbs, and you can see this on the kind of bottom right corner there. The feet of sand coleids are quite a bit more robust. And they also have these raptor-like claws. If you look at these claws, they are quite long and curved. That is quite interesting. But despite this, it doesn't seem like sand coleids were specialized carnivores, even though they have these quite wicked-looking claws, because we have found seeds preserved in their gut as gut contents. So probably they were eating, at least a bit of fruit, a bit of insects, and maybe a bit of everything. And in terms of their beak shape, they are a lot like Salmes that we saw earlier, with a kind of moderately long pointed bill. Doesn't seem especially specialized for any specific kind of food. So yeah, probably quite generalist feeders, and probably weren't behaving exactly like modern mouse birds with this kind of foot. They do seem to have been semi-zygodactyl at least, so they could probably swivel the outermost toe back to point backwards. But yeah, other than that, they probably weren't like using the kind of dangling position that modern mouse birds use. We do also have specimens that preserve feathers, like seen in the top right here, and you can see that they have incredibly long tail feathers. But even then, these are not as long as the tail feathers of modern mouse birds, so they probably weren't using the tail feathers as a prop or anything like that, which modern mouse birds do. Their wings do resemble modern mouse birds, though, with a relatively short, rounded shape. And the raptor-like talons are also quite interesting because we spoke last time about the distribution of raptorial behaviors in Teleravies, and how people have suggested that maybe the ancestral Teleravian might have been a raptorial predator, and that all other all their Teleravians, even the non-raptorial ones, actually had ancestors that were feeding on other animals, other vertebrates, which is certainly still a possibility. And perhaps, these talons in these stem mouse birds that otherwise don't seem very raptorial is potentially evidence for this. Who knows? It would be definitely interesting to see if we can find any fossils of birds that even more closely approximate the last common ancestor of Teleraves. And while I'm here, since I didn't mention it last time, I think I should mention the Paleocene comic by Mike Kesey. Uh, so he has a comic called Paleocene, which you can buy from his online store. I think it's still ongoing. There are several volumes kind of in the series, and I think he's released two of them or so. Um, but anyway, the premise of the comic is that it focuses on early primates during the Paleocene, like rather shortly after the KPG mass extinction. In fact, it's pretty interesting because in the comic, basically, it takes place at a time when most of the primates don't really remember the KPG mass extinction, um, but it still kind of lives on as a sort of legend in their culture, I guess. So
Mhm.
the animals in the story, they're not super anthropomorphized. They generally behave like naturalistically, but they we do see them like kind of talk to each other and have thoughts and things. So yeah, and in there, the primates basically have folklore about a time when dragons ruled the earth, non-avian dinosaurs, and then this big catastrophe happened and the world died and the dragons were gone and things like that. And in fact, a few elderly individuals in the story do still remember a time during the Mesozoic when there were non-avian dinosaurs around. So that's pretty cool. And anyways, the reason I bring up the Paleocene comic is that one of the characters in the comic is actually intended to be an ancestral Teleravian, and it is drawn basically as a raptorial predator that menaces the early primates. So that is a kind of interesting plot point to work in there. Pretty cool.
Yeah.
So do you have anything else to add about this group or about the Paleocene or anything?
Oh, well, certainly, I am familiar with that comic. I got a. Oh man, there's a lot of graphic novels and things that I need to like buy. Support all these artists that I really enjoy. That's such a neat concept, and yeah, like I am just impressed at the level of diversity among all these mouse birds. I mean, given like again the time range, I wouldn't be surprised if there are many more
Oh
surprises
yeah.
in the fossil record of Africa and elsewhere that maybe that we haven't even thought about yet, like aquatic mouse birds and
Right.
stork-like mouse birds and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, who
That
knows?
would be
Definitely, they've surprised us several times. I'm sure they'll very likely surprise us again. Um, we definitely are quite dependent on these sites where a lot of bird fossils accumulate, these Lagerstätten, where these small, delicate skeletons can be preserved. So, yeah, who knows how much diversity we're missing. Definitely, even with just a few snapshots of these ancient environments, we see this immense diversity in this group. So there really was a kind of great mousebird dynasty once upon a time, and now they're only restricted to Africa. Um, so I guess for the record, it seems that mousebirds in North America only lasted until the end of the Eocene or so, if that. Um, However, in Europe, we do have mousebird fossils going all the way into the Miocene before they disappear. So yeah, they hung on for quite a while, and definitely they did quite a lot with the time they had. All right, so let's go on to the next slide. So before we jump into the more specific groups, the remaining groups that we're going to cover belong to a group of coraciimorphs called cavitates. And so this name translates to cavity birds, and the reason for that is because the members of this group all tend to nest in cavities. So it's a quite a straightforward and descriptive name, which I kind of like. Now, by cavities, that can actually mean a lot of things. So typically, we will probably think hollow trees or tree hollows, where they'll kind of find a hole in a tree and then build a nest inside, or maybe not even bother to do that, just lay an egg inside. Um, but they can actually be quite diverse in terms of their nesting sites. So some species will nest between rock crevices, for example. Some species will dig burrows in the ground and nest in them. We'll see a lot of those in the next episode. So basically, there are many kinds of cavities I would do for these birds. But certainly tree hollows are quite popular, as you can see on the picture here. This is a female resplendent quetzal visiting her nest hole. And if you don't know what a male looks like, go to the title slide of this episode, and you'll see why they're called the resplendent quetzal. Yeah, quite a very distinctive looking bird, and certainly nesting in tree cavities is a pretty good strategy because cavities tend to be pretty safe. You know, there aren't that many things that can just make a hole wider if it's already there between whether it's between rocks or in a tree trunk. Um, so if you have a cavity that is only big enough for something uh, your size or smaller than you, then that's usually pretty safe from most kinds of predators. So certainly cavitaves have hit upon a pretty good strategy in terms of their nesting behavior, and they can be found all over the world. Although the particular groups that we'll see today are not quite so cosmopolitan in their distribution, for probably for other reasons, as we shall see. And they are diverse, over 700 living species. There are some possible fossils from the Paleocene, but definitely from the Eocene onwards, we have fossil members of Cavitaves. So let's take a look. On the next slide, we'll see the first of these groups. This is a group I think that very few people have probably heard of. So this is a group called the Courols, which are only known from one living species. So it's the Courol, though actually you'll probably more commonly see it called the cuckoo roller.
Mm.
Yeah, even though it is not especially closely related to cuckoos, which we've already covered in the series, or to rollers, which are members of Cavitaves, but not especially close to the Courols. Um, so it is called the cuckoo roller, but it's not either of those types of birds. And of course, as you know, or as you probably know, I like names that kind of emphasize the phylogenetic distinctiveness of species when they are available. So I prefer the alternate name Courol. I'm pretty sure a Courol is kind of an abbreviation for cuckoo roller, anyways. But but still, kind of anything that makes it sound more distinctive, I think I'm down with that. Now, today, Courols are only known from a few select regions on Earth. They have a very restricted distribution on Madagascar and the Comoros Islands. Um, but we shall see that there are fossil members known from Europe and North America, so they once had a much wider distribution. And they mostly feed on large invertebrates and small vertebrates, so they'll sit around on branches and they'll fly out and capture their prey if they spot it. They especially like to eat chameleons and other kinds of lizards. So chameleons and geckos are some of their main prey items. And they're not especially rare within their restricted range, but they are unfortunately very poorly studied. So there is actually a lot about their overall biology that we don't really know much about. Um, and it is with the genetic studies, of course, that we have kind of really begun to tease out where exactly Courols belong in bird phylogeny. However, even before we had the really good genetic data, on morphological grounds, people already had pointed out that this thing probably isn't a roller. This thing is pretty weird and distinctive. So yeah, it definitely has been recognized for a long time as being a member of its kind of very distinctive lineage and probably distantly related to all other living birds. Um, yeah, definitely an interesting species. I wish we knew more about it. What do you think?
Yeah, I think so too. I definitely agree with you. Like, I am like in that camp of like we giving distinct names to organisms if they are like distinct
Mhm.
from others. Of course, a place like Madagascar, that's
Oh
like
yeah,
distinction central for,
right,
for a
right,
lot of
exactly.
animals. Um, But yeah, no, I agree. This is certainly an interesting bird, um, because it's so poorly studied.
Right.
What kind of neat behaviors are have we not documented yet?
Hmm. Absolutely, yeah. And we certainly don't know much about their breeding behavior. It does seem to nest in tree holes like a lot of the other Cavitavians do. But yeah, we don't really know a whole lot about how it rears its young or anything like that. So hopefully people do more field studies on it soon. Um, Now, even though there's only one species living today on these islands in the Indian Ocean, they were once a lot more diverse and a lot more widespread. So we shall see on the next slide some of these stem Courols. So far, all these named species of stem Courols have been classified in the genus Plesiocathardes. And Plesiocathardes was originally named based on like a single foot bone from the Eocene of Europe. Yeah. And if you know your bird scientific names, Cathardes is the genus of New World vultures, or a genus of New World vultures, specifically the turkey vulture and its relatives. Um, and so it was actually originally thought that Plesiocathardes was an early New World vulture, basically. Um, However, we now have much more complete skeletons of Plesiocathardes, as can be seen here, and we now know that it is very probably not a New World vulture, and instead is actually a stem Courol. Like, dang, who would have expected that? Um, yeah, a super geographically restricted, single species actually has this kind of very rich family tree extending back into the deep past. Um, and so here are just a few examples of the species of Plesiocathardes that have been named. I think there are about five or so, some from Europe and some from North America. So these two are some of the best preserved ones. That's why I chose to show them. So again, we're looking at the Meso and the Green River formations here. So on the left is Plesiocathardes kelleri from the Meso, and you can see here that the feathers are preserved in this specimen, which is really lovely. In fact, it's so well preserved that if you look carefully, the tail feather that's preserved there actually has a sort of banded pattern. So we actually have a bit of an idea about what the color pattern on this particular species was, which is pretty cool. And then on the right there is Plesiocathardes wyomingensis from the Green River Formation. So that's a North American species that lived during the Eocene. And overall, in terms of their general morphology, these Eocene stem Courols are actually pretty similar to the modern Courol. Like there is some variation in size. So I think Plesiocathardes kelleri is smaller than the modern Courol. Wyomingensis is about the same size, and there is one also from North America called Plesiocathardes major. No points for guessing why it's called that, which is bigger than the modern Courol. But overall, it seems that they were generally pretty similar to the modern species. So yeah, that's pretty curious. The kind of Kuro body plan has basically been around for over 50 million years, and now it is kind of restricted to this very small geographic area, which is a really interesting pattern. I don't think we see that in birds very much. We do see that in some other animals, like things like the tuatara from New Zealand, of course, um, and because of this, it has been argued that the Kuro could be considered a living fossil. Of course, that term is a rather controversial one in evolutionary biology, but certainly it does represent an animal that's very similar to its ancient close relatives, and has become very limited in diversity and geographic distribution over deep time. So yeah, that is rather curious. Do you have anything to add about these?
Not particularly, no.
Yeah, they are quite interesting, but we can continue onward to the next group. And these are the Trogons, and the Trogons are quite a bit more widespread than the Mousebirds or the Courols. They are found in Africa, Asia, and the Americas, but they're restricted to tropical regions. So yeah, and now because of their kind of probably because of their greater worldwide distribution, they are also more diverse with over 40 living species. So they're still doing fairly well, but it does seem that they aren't quite as widespread as they once were because we do have fossils of them from Europe, and we'll see a few of them shortly. And Trogons have all kinds of weird and unusual features, but probably one of their most distinctive traits is that their feet are what we call heterodactyl. So this is yet another term related to toe arrangement, and they are the only birds that we know of that have heterodactyl feet. So heterodactyl means that in addition to the first toe, the hallux being reversed and pointing backwards, the second toe, so the second innermost toe on the foot, is also reversed and pointing backwards, which is very odd because most birds that have two toes pointing backwards have the innermost and the outermost toe pointing backwards. That's the zygodactyl foot, which is seen in several different groups. But Trogons are the only ones that have done this heterodactyl kind of condition. And why is that? I don't know. I'm not sure anyone has even tried to really figure that out. But it is super distinctive. Well, there are a couple of cases of fossil birds that have been considered possibly heterodactyl. There's an Eocene bird from China that might have heterodactyl feet, and possibly is closely related to Trogons, in which case it's not really an independent evolution of the heterodactyl foot. And there is actually a stem bird, an opposite bird, an Ontiornithian, from the early Cretaceous that has been considered possibly to have this kind of heterodactyl foot condition. However, that specimen is quite poorly studied, and probably what looks like a heterodactyl condition might be taphonomic, so it just happened to be preserved in a way that looks like it has that. So that might not be an actual real thing. So as far as we know for sure, Trogons are the only heterodactyl birds. So that's definitely gives them some uniqueness points.
They should give this whole group the name the weird foot bird.
Yeah, right. Definitely, yeah. That actually would be a pretty good name for the coraciimorphs. Yeah, I don't think I mentioned it, but the Courol has semi-zygodactyl feet with the outermost toe pointing backwards, and it can kind of swivel it to point fully backwards when it needs to. So yeah, this entire group has some very weird feet, and this will continue into the into the next episode too, because the groups that will meet there, they too have their own unusual foot adaptations. So definitely the aberrant-footed birds or something like that. That would be a pretty good name for these guys for sure. Now, in terms of their behavior, Trogons spend a lot of time just sitting still on branches, and they just sit there and wait and look around for food. They like to eat fruits and small animals. Typically, that means insects, but sometimes small vertebrates too. And different species have kind of different preferences in terms of diet. Some will eat mostly fruit, some will eat mostly insects, but most of them will eat a sort of mixture of both to some extent. And when they find something they like to eat, they'll fly out from their perch and grab it in flight. Like even if it's fruit, they'll kind of fly past it and grab it from the branch and pluck it off while they're flying by. So yeah, that's the way they feed. And kind of their habit of sitting still can it can be a good thing for birders, but also not, because since they like to sit still, so you can kind of you can stand there and watch them for a little bit, but it also makes them pretty hard to spot. As you can see from the image here, Trogons can be quite brightly colored, but most of them have this kind of greenish backside. So what they're very good at is that if they know you're there, they'll actually turn their back on you. And because they like to live in forested environments where they're surrounded by greenery and vegetation, it's very difficult to spot them under those conditions. Yeah, that's I suppose works out for them, I guess. Probably reduces predation pressure. And as for their nesting behavior, that is also quite distinctive. So what they do is like other cavitavians, they nest in tree cavities, and they don't only use existing cavities, although sometimes they do, because after all, that saves work. But if they can't find an existing one, they'll make their own in rotting trees or in termite nests. And the way they do this is they'll actually bite holes into these trees or termite nests. Yeah, like biting, not pecking. They bite holes into these. And this is actually how they got their name, because the name Trogon means nibbling or gnawing, and it's named after this kind of behavior that they have of kind of biting holes to make these nesting cavities. So that's pretty interesting. Um, and even though the males are more brightly colored, both parents will actually share parental care duties, and both will help care for the young and incubate the eggs and so on, which is pretty unusual among birds. Usually in birds, um, cases where the males are much more, brightly colored or much more elaborate display structures than the females. Um, that's often because the males invest a lot more in that courtship and trying to attract as many females as possible, and often don't really have much, if anything, to do with parental care, which tends to fall to the female. But interestingly, in Trogons, even though the males are often a lot more brightly colored, both parents will undertake parental care duties, even in things like the resplendent Quetzal, where the male is extremely kind of extravagant with this really long tail feathers. Yeah, if you've never seen a picture of one, or if you've never been lucky enough to see one in real life, go look at pictures of those guys. They are amazing. Um, but yeah, incredible tail feathers. But even the male resplendent Quetzal partakes in parental care, so that's pretty neat. Yeah, of course the resplendent Quetzal also features quite heavily in some South American cultures. So the Mayans and the Aztecs, they definitely saw the Quetzal as a symbol of their deity Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, and it's probably not hard to see why someone would deify a bird like that. Like, what an incredible looking animal, right? And with that kind of long tail kind of streaming out behind it, I can definitely see a resemblance to imagery of a feathered serpent god for sure. So definitely the Quetzals are highly prized by humans for their aesthetics, and have been for a while. Do you have anything to add about these guys before we look at
Oh,
the fossils?
yeah, for sure. I think I think the Quetzal is like the national bird of Guatemala.
I think so.
So like
Yes.
that status has not really gone away.
No.
Yeah, resplendent is certainly. I'm definitely familiar with Quetzals because
Yeah.
I used to always laugh whenever I like open up an animal encyclopedia. Like to show these Trogons and like they're all cool and they're pretty, but then the Quetzal just takes up like half the page.
Right. So extra.
So like definitely, I definitely was familiar with it.
Right.
Um, I feel like I've seen some
Hmm.
in like in a zoo or two.
Yeah.
Like because it's a like they are like very like iconic birds. So
Mhm.
I can't think of anything off the top of my head right now, but I'm pretty sure I've seen some
Right. Right.
before.
Yeah. I've seen them a couple times in captivity for sure. Unfortunately, not in the wild yet, but yeah, they are definitely really nice to look at and very cool birds in general. Because just look at all these weird habits and features that they have. Um, and there is one species of trogon that gets a little bit of the United States. That's the elegant trogon that gets into a little bit of the southwestern United States in
Right.
breeding season. But yeah, I've never been fortunate enough to see one, unfortunately. Um, so definitely one for the bucket list. Yeah.
It's like in the field guides. Yeah, it's like
Right.
it's in there for a technicality.
Right,
It's like
exactly. Yeah, it gets there a little bit. Yeah. Just makes it beyond the border. Yeah. But otherwise, you're gonna have to go to the tropics of Africa, Asia, and the neotropics. So, but that wasn't the case in the Eocene, because if we go to the next slide, we'll see that they are known from the Eocene of Europe, and we have quite a few pretty nice specimens of them. Um, so on the left there is yet another meso bird. Yeah, meso is the gift that keeps on giving. Um, this is Mesilla trogon from Meso, so Eocene of Germany, and you can see that this is another nice specimen with the feathers all preserved and all that. So in general, it is fairly similar to modern trogons. It has the heterodactyl foot. It does have some minor differences in terms of kind of the details of its forelimb bones and such, but it is recognizably a trogon. And in terms of its feathering, it seems fairly trogon-like as well. Have these rather short wings with long tail feathers. Um, it is smaller than most modern trogons, so that's a difference. But in general, it seems probably to be fairly similar. Um, and I might as well add that trogons they don't like to fly for very long distances. Um, they they mostly fly between trees, and that's about it. Like they, as far as we know, they don't seem to have ever made it across oceans, for example, um, over water dispersal to islands, for example. Even though they're found in Africa, they never made it to Madagascar, unlike some of the other birds that are now found there. So
Hmm.
definitely, since they were formerly distributed so widely, that probably means they basically had this former very wide distribution and weren't like migrating to distant areas or anything like that. Um, and a bit later than Trogon is the Oligocene is from the Oligocene of France. That is Primo Trogon, which is also known for a very nice skeleton. And Primo Trogon is very similar to modern Trogons overall, and is also known from this really nice specimen with the feathers preserved. There actually is also another specimen of a Primo Trogon where is just a wing preserved. But what's interesting about that specimen is that it has been examined for melanosomes. So these are little cell bodies that contain melanin pigment that colors the feathers in birds or helps color the feathers. And it turns out in that specimen, uh, researchers have identified melanosomes that seem to indicate iridescent coloration. So probably Primotrogon had iridescent feathers, just like the modern Trogons do. So that's pretty cool too. Um, and yeah, I think there are Trogon fossils in Europe until the Miocene or so. So they lasted until then, and that, as you can see, is a sort of recurring pattern. We will talk about that shortly. But before we go there, do you have anything to add about Trogons?
No, just that they are just wonderful, beautiful birds.
Yeah, I definitely agree there. Hopefully, I get to see more of them someday.
Same here.
Yeah. All right. Now, we have gone through all the groups today that I intend to talk about in terms of the phylogenetic kind of coverage. However, kind of these groups give us a sort of excuse to look at a particular pattern that we've been seeing in this series, especially in this episode, but not restricted. If you've been following us all the way through, you'll probably notice that we've seen this kind of pattern before in some other bird groups. So, for example, all the way back when we were introducing neoaves, we talked about turricos, these kind of fruit-eating arboreal birds that are only found in sub-Saharan Africa today. And how we actually have Eocene fossils of stem turricos from North America and possibly from Europe. So that's actually what's pictured on the slide here. Well, the genus Foro from the Green River Formation is known from North America. It seems to have been a stem turrico that was mostly ground dwelling, unlike the modern turricos. And there are similar birds to Foro that are known from Europe. So stem turricos are known from the Eocene of North America and the Eocene of Europe, and we also get some more modern-looking turrico fossils into the Miocene of Europe too. But today they're only found in Africa. And there are the oilbirds, which are a group of fruit-eating members of Strysaures. They're the pretty much the only members of that group that habitually feed on fruit, and really there's only one modern species, so it's really the oilbird, that one particular species, and it only lives in South America today, but it did have close relatives in North America and in Europe during the Paleogene. The potus are restricted to the neotropics today. They're a group of Strysaurians. Um, these very well camouflaged birds that kind of perch on dead tree limbs and pretend to be part of the limbs. Very, very interesting birds. Very mimetic as well, as we spoke about. Um, and they are restricted to the neotropics today, but we have stem potus from Europe, from the Eocene. Frogmouths, yet another member of Strysaures. They are only found in Australasia and tropical Asia today, but in the Eocene they could be found all the way in Europe, and possibly in North America too. There's one fossil that, or one species that might be a stem frogmouth from North America. Yeah, but we don't find them there today. Um, and of course, the groups we looked at today, Mousebirds, restricted to Africa today, but known from North America in the Paleogene and Europe from the Paleogene into the Neogene, specifically the Miocene. The Courols are restricted to a few islands in the Indian Ocean today, but stem members are known from North America and Europe during the Paleogene. And Trogons are restricted to tropical regions today, but we have stem members up north in Europe. Um, so, what gives? That is definitely a very interesting pattern. And these are just examples. Like if you look through at our previous episodes and also into our future episodes too, at groups that we haven't covered in detail yet, you'll find other groups that fit similar patterns too. Groups that are restricted to the southern hemisphere or to tropical regions today, formerly much more widespread. So, what's up with that? What happened to this kind of widespread distribution of all these groups? What caused them to become restricted to relative pockets of the world today when they were so successful before? So that's kind of been the subject of a number of studies, and we will discuss that right now on the next slide. So, there have certainly been a number of different suggestions as to what explains this kind of pattern. And specifically for some groups in Europe, people have suggested that probably their extinction in Europe was biological in nature. So, what do I mean by this? During the Paleogene, or much of the Paleogene, Europe was actually largely separated from the other land masses by the ocean. Um, there was this what we call this Turgai Strait that was this inland sea across Asia that kind of separated Europe from Asia, and you can see this on the lower maps over here. So don't worry too much about the colors yet, and we'll talk about that later. But in the top is a map of the modern world. On the lower left is a map during the Eocene, the early Eocene, and on the lower right is a map during the late Eocene. So basically, the chronology goes from lower left to lower right to the top. And you can see that as we approach the late Eocene, the inland sea in the middle of Asia gets smaller, and it gradually retreats. And so around the Eocene-Oligocene boundary, we see this closure of the Turgai Strait, and this probably would have allowed animals to travel from Asia, to continental Asia, into Europe, and bringing with them, various new ecological changes. Like, for example, maybe there are more carnivorous mammals started showing up, or various groups of rodents started showing up, and these are, of course, major nest predators of birds today. And so people have suggested that because in Europe we see some groups that seem to disappear at the end of the Eocene and don't make it into the Neogene. So maybe they died out because of biological factors when the Turgai Strait kind of retreated and allowed more animals to enter Europe that caused various avian extinctions in Europe. Could be. But overall, in terms of the general kind of global patterns, it seems that the biggest factor was probably climate change. And so there was this really interesting study that came out a couple years ago by Aaron Salp and colleagues, including my supervisor. And what they did was they basically modeled the kind of habitat tolerances of different modern bird groups that we know used to have a greater range in the Paleogene. So, for example, here the example is mousebirds. And so basically they looked at modern mousebirds and looked at where modern mousebirds live today. And then they basically took the climatic features, the features of the climate of the habitats where mousebirds live today. So what kind of temperatures, what kind of humidity, and so on do they like? And then they, kind of tabulated this all together and fed it into a model. And then what the model did was that it would predict based on what we know about climate during the Eocene, and they did this for other time periods throughout the Cenozoic as well. During the Eocene, where were the habitats that would have been suitable to mousebirds? And then it would plot them on a world map. And so that's basically what you're seeing in the figure here. So the regions in green on the two Eocene maps below are the regions that were identified as being kind of mousebird-friendly habitats based on their temperature and humidity and other features of the climate, according to their models. And very interestingly, you can see on the maps here marked are with the white dots are fossil sites where mousebird fossils have been found dating to these time periods. And you can see they overlap pretty much exactly with the regions on the map that were marked as being, places mousebirds would like to live. So that is really cool. And they did this with not just mousebirds, but also a lot of the groups I mentioned before. And for most part, they all largely show this very similar kinds of patterns. And so, what does this tell us? Well, first of all, it tells us that it seems that in many of these cases, the stem members of these lineages had very similar habitat preferences to their closest living relatives, which is really interesting because, that's not necessarily an assumption that we would expect to hold up. We might expect that they've had some changes in habitat tolerance over the eons. But it seems that for many of these groups, they've largely had much the same habitat preferences for a very long time, for millions of years. Um, and for another, this strongly suggests that it was a climate change that kind of drove these groups to their very restricted distributions of today. So it seems that whereas Europe and North America were nice for stem mousebirds and all the other groups you mentioned before, the stem Courols and stem Trogons and so on, um, they are not so nice today, and so that's why these birds are no longer found in these regions today. And of note is that all of these groups are, essentially tropical groups. They like nice warm climates, which certainly was the case during the Eocene. So the Earth basically undergoes, well, I wouldn't say cycles. The Earth basically alternates between different climatic regimes, and they don't really have a kind of a exact schedule or anything. They don't have an exact periodicity. It's not like every several million years they switch between them, but depending on the different factors that are around on Earth at the time, the Earth can be one of two different major climatic regimes, and these are a greenhouse climate or an icehouse climate. Now, currently, in the world we're living in right now, it is an icehouse climate. An icehouse climate is characterized by having ice caps at the poles and usually relatively low carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere, so less greenhouse gases, and lower sea levels. And so, overall, a relatively cooler and drier kind of climate. Whereas the other kind of climatic regime is called a greenhouse regime, where there are no ice caps at the poles, at least not permanent ones. The the sea levels are usually much higher. There's much more there's much more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere usually, so it's much warmer around the world. And the Eocene, for most part, was largely under a greenhouse world regime, and so we have all these groups that are suited to kind of tropical environments. But over time, as the Earth changed throughout the Cenozoic, there started to be a trend of cooling and drying. And so there were several factors that probably led up to this. One was kind of the fact that Australia and South America started to split further away from Antarctica, which allowed the circumantarctic polar current to form. So this is an ocean current that goes around and around and around the continent of Antarctica, and because it stays all the way down there all the time, it never goes up into kind of warmer regions of the world, and it just stays cold down there, right? And so it's also kind of keeping warm waters from entering Antarctica, and so that creates a really cold spot on the Earth that it starts to affect the rest of the globe. In addition to that, there's also the mountain building of the Himalayas because India started drifting northward and eventually it would hit continental Asia. And with that, we got the mountain building of the Himalayas. Um, and something that I think probably isn't familiar to most people is that the process of mountain building leads to a lot more rock weathering. So a lot more rocks get exposed because the crust is getting all crumpled up and thrust into the air, basically. And the process of in the process of weathering these rocks, there's not only physical erosion, but also a chemical weathering. So carbon dioxide in the atmosphere actually reacts with the rocks. And in doing so, that kind of removes a lot of the carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, which of course removes these greenhouse gases and causes the Earth to become overall cooler and drier in terms of its climate. And so all these changes have been were going on like throughout the much of the Cenozoic after the Eocene, and so gradually the warmer and more tropical kind of climates that mousebirds and Courols and Trogons and a lot of these other bird groups seem to like started to get drawn more and more towards the equator until probably we got the kind of distribution that we see today, and eventually they disappeared from North America and from Europe. Do you have anything to add about this, in general?
It's an interesting phenomena. It reminds me a lot of what was happening with primate
Mm-hmm.
evolution.
Mm.
You had like a lot of native primates in North America and in Eurasia. Um, there's still a little bit of discourse about where that group originated in the
Right.
northern hemisphere. A lot of data is pointing to Eurasia at the moment. But yeah, like they were able to survive because of all these forests. But then once you started getting like this gradual cooling of the climate due to all these different factors, you start seeing the disappearance of a lot of these species in North America and across Eurasia until they're mostly found in the tropics and in Africa in
Mm.
particular. So yeah, like this is certainly a major event in the Earth's history, and you can see this in a lot of different organismal groups as well. Of course, like you read about how there are like crocodiles and
Mm-hmm.
palm trees in like Greenland and Alaska and
Right.
stuff because it was so warm. But of course, you don't see a lot of those at all anymore
Yeah.
because of like these changes in climate, and
Exactly.
it's just a fascinating phenomenon to me.
Yeah. Definitely. Really has shaped how the world, is like it is today. Yeah. Definitely a really major kind of event with heavy implications for the, biosphere. All right. I have another slide about this. So, I think there are a few lessons we can take from learning about this, I think. So first of all, and more specifically to studying bird evolution, well, it can apply to studying other groups of organisms as well, but I think it's been a particular kind of a thorn in the side of people who study birds, is looking at biogeographic history. Um, don't assume that the way things are today is the way that they have always been. Um, so there's a really popular hypothesis that modern birds, crown birds, originated in the southern hemisphere. In large part, that is based on looking at the distributions of modern birds, because a lot of these modern bird groups are restricted to the southern hemisphere, or at least to continents that were part of the southern hemisphere supercontinent Gondwana. If you run an analysis, so we can do what we call ancestral state reconstruction with a geographic distribution, much like we can for anatomical features. So, for example, we can look at what features two closely related living groups have, what features they share, and then we can infer that their last common ancestor would have also had those features, right? And we can often do that similarly with a geographic distribution. So if we find two closely related groups in a similar kind of area, then it is reasonable to infer that their last common ancestor lived also in that area and they perhaps originated there. And people have tried to do this with birds, and they have often come to the conclusion that yes, there is very strong evidence that modern birds originated in the southern hemisphere. Because look, we ran this analysis including all these modern birds, and this is the result that we got. And indeed, if you look on the left here, the kind of graph on the left, and don't worry too much if you can't read all the words and stuff. But basically, what this is showing is pink is Gondwana, or the southern hemisphere. Blue represents groups that are known from the northern hemisphere. And if you run an ancestral state reconstruction using all these living groups, and try to trace their ancestral geographic distribution way back, you can see that all the way on the leftmost side, their last common ancestor. of all modern birds is strongly inferred to be a southern hemisphere species. But because we know from the fossil record that a lot of these groups used to have very wide distributions living in places where they're not found today, that is very important to take into account when we're running these analyses. And unfortunately, oftentimes this hasn't been done in this kind of study. So on the right there, we can see what happens if we do include fossils of various of these groups. And as we've seen in this episode, a lot of these groups that are now restricted to the southern continents actually were found in the northern hemisphere once upon a time. And so if you take into account this fact, and try to trace back the ancestral distribution of all living birds, you actually get a much more ambiguous result. That circle, if you can't really see it clearly, for the last common ancestor of all crowned birds, basically shows a almost 50-50% chance of the last common ancestor of birds being either from the southern hemisphere or from the northern hemisphere. So that's a big change in the results. In terms of the confidence that we have in those results as well. So yeah, there's a real lesson to be had there. Like don't ignore the fossils. Like your data is your analysis, and your results are only as good as the data you put into it. And if you're excluding data that we know exist but aren't taking into account in the analysis, that can give you something very, very different. What do you think?
No, I definitely agree. There's similar problems with this in paleoanthropology too,
Right.
especially in regards to like the expansion of Homo sapiens around the
Mm,
world. You had a lot of these early studies that had just focused on like mitochondrial Y chromosomal DNA,
mm,
but they were often ignoring both the fossil record and the just like total genomic data, of
right,
course, which
right.
wasn't available at the time. So like to be fair on that end,
Yeah, right.
but like once you incorporate that data, like the models that you discover or produce, I should say, um, do change in quite a number of significant ways.
Right,
So yeah,
right.
I absolutely see this. It makes me wonder about like mammals as a whole too.
Mm,
You have like the two great groups of placentals, the Laurasiatheres
mm-hmm.
and the Atlantogenatans, and those have been named solely because um, it's generally thought that the common ancestor of either groups lived in Laurasia
Right.
or I guess Gondwana, if you will. Um, but it is curious, like if you incorporate like all these different like mammalian fossil groups, like
Mm-hmm.
does that actually hold up?
Right. Yeah. I'd be interested to know for sure. As far as I know, and my knowledge of the Cenozoic mammal fossil record is somewhat limited, but as far as I know, I think the pattern holds a bit better for mammals, but definitely there's
Okay.
still room for doubt. Um, for example, you have things like the South American native ungulates, which show up very, very early in the Cenozoic in the southern hemisphere, even though they are potentially like Laurasiatheres, which are presumably a northern hemisphere group. So how and when did they get there? Um, that's a that's certainly an open question, I think. Um, but yeah, definitely, I definitely a real good takeaway of all this is that take into account all the data that you have, um, and if you want the most robust kind of results.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and sometimes they give you ambiguous results, like as seen here. But that's telling us something, right? That's telling us that we don't know, and sometimes that's a very important thing to find out too. Um, Yeah, and yeah, I didn't mention this earlier, but definitely I know that kind of ancestral state reconstruction for biogeography has of course been done a lot on regarding human origins, and I'm sure a lot of the material that you've been covering in your series has been based on similar studies like this.
Oh, more or less, yeah.
Yeah, so that's kind of a lesson we can take away from the research front of things. But I think there's also a lesson we can take away more generally too, like not just in the research field. Um, and I think that lesson is that climate change can have a pretty big impact on the biosphere, right? Um,
Oh yeah.
yeah, and of course, climate change is a real hot topic now because there is ongoing anthropogenic climate change um, that's happening very quickly and that we are causing through our activities. And so there is, of course, a lot of interest in how this is going to affect life today, including ourselves. Um, and there have certainly been a number of patterns that have emerged from that, but I think I won't go into too much detail about that here because that's not the focus of the series. But you know, people sometimes say, "Oh, well, the climate has changed in the past, so it's okay, life will survive," and so on. And it's true that life will survive, yes, but we can also see that life has changed a lot when these climate changes happen. Um, and certainly that is the case here. Uh, if you live in the U.S. today or in Europe, you don't see mousebirds or trogons or Courols like visiting your backyard. But if you were living during the Eocene, you would have probably. So there has clearly been great biotic turnover driven by these climate changes. And so how is life going to change in response to anthropogenic climate change? I mean, it already is changing. We're already seeing some of these changes take place, but probably
Mhm.
the answer is quite drastically. And that's definitely going to affect us too. Um, and I think something that people don't like to hear is probably the way that these changes are going to affect us is going to require us to change some of the ways in which we do things if we want to continue to live comfortably. um, and yeah, it is true, we really do need to find ways to um, kind of mitigate or live with the effects of the climate change that is happening now. And something else to keep in mind is that the overall cooling and drying trend over the Cenozoic that caused these avian range contractions, they happened over millions and millions of years. So there was a lot of time for these groups to gradually adapt to these changes. And so sure, like they got driven out of North America and Europe by these changes, but they didn't go extinct entirely because they were able to gradually track their favored climates down to the more equatorial regions where they live now. And in fact, all three of the groups that we talked about today, the Mousebirds and Courols and Trogons, are doing relatively well. Mousebirds are, as far as I know, like none of the species are endangered. Courols, even though they're only found on a few islands, they're not endangered at the moment. Um, Trogons have a few species that are considered vulnerable, so they're certainly of conservation concern, but that's still a relative minority. Most of the others are doing fairly well. Um, so yeah, they do persist, but first of all, at a much decreased kind of biogeographic range and probably in many cases also species diversity, but also they have had time to kind of um, adapt to these changes and manage to survive. Um, at the rate that we are changing climate today, probably a lot of species will not be able to keep up with the pace and will probably die out before they are able to adapt to these changes.
Yeah, I think it's important to recognize too that a lot of like habitats are very fragmented.
Right.
So it's like a lot of these birds and other organisms were able to survive because they could actually like go to places over
Exactly.
time where like they could gain a foothold. But I mean, as we, as a lot of these different habitats have been like dramatically shrunk, first of all,
Yeah.
and then separated by like cities and roads and various development projects. Like it's increasingly difficult for a lot of these animals to go where they need to. I mean,
Hmm.
like a black bear going into a neighborhood just to go somewhere else, like that's such a huge deal that
Right.
it causes lots of problems for people, but it causes problems for the bear because the bear's just trying to find food and go somewhere. But you have
Hmm.
all these people. We got to get rid of the bear. We got to put
Right.
it
Right.
where it came from. It's a danger, and so then
Yeah.
any potential range shift is diminished by things like that. So
Right. Yeah, that's an excellent point. And yeah, I remember seeing a comic like many years ago. I don't remember the exact source, but it was basically it basically showed a bear in the woods, and then the next panel shows that the woods have been people have moved in and built houses and such in the region where there was a forest, and the bear is still there, and then someone pops up and it's like, oh my god, a bear, where did you come from? And the bear is like, I've always been here.
Right.
Yeah,
Oh, yeah, I know that one too. I
yeah,
like that one.
yeah,
But yeah,
yeah.
it illustrates a good point for sure.
Right, right. Um, and yeah, and some people also say things like, well, in recent times there have already been like pretty dramatic climate changes throughout the Pleistocene, um, where there were like these interglacial and glacial cycles that could sometimes happen very quickly and shift between and cycle between one another, and that is true. But the way that we are changing climate today with the great you know output of greenhouse gases is different from the kind of climate changes that were happening uh, for these interglacial and glacial cycles. Like those were driven partly by the changes in the orbit of the Earth, the minor variations in the shape of the Earth, and they could be counted on to kind of to cycle back and forth between one another. But the way we're doing things, we're warming the climate in a completely different way, and so potentially the next glacial period is not one that we might live to see, right? Uh, we live our current civilization became established during an interglacial period, and we've become very used to living in one. Um, but kind of the next thing on the horizon, if the cycle of interglacials and glacials were to continue, would have been another glacial period. But with the current anthropogenic climate change, uh, that could be delayed or even staved off for the foreseeable future. Um, and again, there are these two kinds of climate regimes: the greenhouse worlds and the icehouse worlds. And we've been in an icehouse world for the past 30 million years or so. Um, could we actually be making could we actually be turning the regime into a greenhouse climate regime in the future? I think that's certainly a real possibility to consider if the ice caps eventually melt completely. Well, yeah, we're gonna see some big changes, and it was a sort of change from greenhouse to icehouse that caused a lot of these massive rain shifts during the Cenozoic. So you know, who knows what's going to happen if we get to that kind of extreme resulting scenario.
Oh yeah, and I think it's also important to add too that like the carbon that's being released into the atmosphere now,
Hmm.
like that wasn't a part of the carbon cycle originally.
Right, right.
So it's like people like, oh well, the climate was warm before, but like yeah, like that's because like the natural carbon cycle was working off plants and animals, but like
Hmm.
all this carbon that's been around since the Carboniferous
Right.
and other times, that's now being added at a alarmingly fast rate to the carbon cycle,
Hmm.
and so it's not that the climate's changed before; it's that
Right.
it's changing in a much different way
Yeah.
than we're used to.
Exactly. Exactly. As well as the rest of our modern life on Earth too. Um, and yeah, that's definitely very true. And not only that, but like the greenhouse gases that we're pumping into the atmosphere now, especially carbon dioxide, that's going to take ages and ages and ages to remove from the atmosphere. Like the kind of cycling of the atmospheric carbon uh, back into the ground through rock weathering, that happens very, very, very slowly. So,
Hmm.
even if we stopped emitting any greenhouse gases like right now, uh, it's still going to be having this kind of warming effect for many, many, many kind of years into the future for sure. Mm.
Yeah. I definitely would like to talk more about anthropogenic climate change
Mm.
and related effects at a later time as
Right,
well.
right. Mm.
I guess without giving too much away, the final episode of my series, Humanity: A Prologue, will be covering this topic as well.
Hmm.
So definitely a lot to think about as far as like the impact on life on Earth and humanity as well.
Excellent, excellent. Well, I look forward to it. It's certainly it's not a cheery topic, but I think it's a very important one for sure.
Hmm.
Um, and yeah, I think I think I'll leave the reins to you then to cover that in more detail. But yeah, to conclude on my end of things, I think um, that the takeaway that I wanted to say here is that yeah, we should do what we can to kind of both both adapt to but also mitigate and slow down the climate change that we're causing right now. Because, well, first of all, it is in our power to do so.
Hmm.
And secondly, it will be better for all of us and the natural world that we depend on if we do. So, yeah, I think that's an important takeaway of studying this kind of thing in the fossil record.
Absolutely.
All right, let's go to the next slide, and I think it's the last main slide. So finally, let's come back to the birds for now and review their phylogenetic relationships. So today we looked at members of coraciimorphae, specifically the mousebirds, Courols, and Trogons. So I mentioned that the position of mousebirds is still a little bit uncertain, but for now I kind of provisionally accept that they are members of coraciimorphae. Um, and meanwhile, the Courols, Trogons, and this third group that we'll talk about next belong to a group called Cavitates, the cavity nesters. Now, if you're wondering, mousebirds don't nest in cavities. They actually build little woven cup-like nests in tree branches, so they are kind of different in that regard. They're definitely the odd ones out in many respects. Um, but yeah, cavitates prefer to use cavities in trees, and as we shall see next time, many of them also dig burrows as well, and that'll be members of the group Picocoraceae. So this is a group that is much more diverse than the three groups that we looked at today, um, and actually did end up with a more or less worldwide distribution now. So if we go to the next slide to the preview, we shall see some members of this group. We shall look at the hornbills and kingfishers and woodpeckers and many others too, members of Picocoraceae. They are an extremely colorful bunch, as I think you can tell from the images here. And they come in all kinds of shapes and sizes and have all kinds of weird adaptations. Yeah, seriously, like I like this group a lot, and some of them are just so bizarre in terms of like their habits and their specialization. So I'm definitely looking forward to talking more about these guys. Um, but until then, this has been this episode of Dinosaurs: The Second Chapter, and I'd like to thank our friends Henry and Alicia as always for their contributions. Henry for the music, Alicia for my color scheme. Um, and you can follow us on Twitter for more updates if you enjoyed the show. Uh, Subscribe to our YouTube channel through Time and Clades, to follow us directly. If you have questions, please leave comments or send them to our email. We love receiving feedback. And of course, as always, I will have links to references for this episode in the description. All right, next time. Well, in fact, at the time when we release this episode, it'll already be May, and so we will definitely be recording the next episode when May begins. Um, yeah, I guess we're going to do another news show, aren't we?
Yeah, that sounds about right to me.
Alrighty. So yeah, looking forward to that. See what happened in the field of natural history in April, and then after that we'll return to Jones' series on human origins, and I'm sure we're all excited to continue that.
Right, that one will be about the development of agriculture
Ooh.
throughout human societies and its various effects.
That's certainly a big leap forward. Now, all right. So, until then, we will, see you next time and take care, everybody.
Yep, see y'all later. Thanks for joining us.
Indeed.